Hey everyone, excited to be back for this week's edition of Frequently Asked Questions for Commercial Real Estate. In today's video, what I want to do is talk about some of the provisions that you need to look out for as you're analyzing these lease agreements so that you can avoid the common pitfalls that a lot of business owners fall into when they're analyzing these lease agreements. So before we dive in this video, I'd greatly appreciate if you can like and subscribe to this channel. It really does make a difference in the YouTube algorithm and ensures more and more people can hear this message and learn about the many facets of commercial real estate. So now you've done that, go ahead and like and subscribe below. Let's go ahead and dive into this episode. All right. So the question is, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see business owners make as they review these types of lease agreements? Now, in today's video, I'm going to share just three for you that I see very, very commonly. You know, there's obviously many more that you need to consider, but these are some of the top three that I often see business owners kind of miss when it comes to the way that they review these types of lease agreements. Now, before we dive in and I share all this information, I want to preface this by saying that I am not an attorney, so don't take this as legal advice. Really, what I'm going to be focusing on is the business terms of the actual lease agreement, and that's what the lens with which I'm viewing this particular video. I'm not going to share what the language needs to be in a lease agreement to cover this, but again, these are just some of the business considerations that you need to make as you're reviewing these types of lease agreements. So that's my warning to you thus far, but let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so one of the first things that I often see people not take into consideration is operating expense increases over time. Now, if you are operating in a triple net environment, meaning that you are going to sign a lease that does require you to pay your pro rata share of taxes, insurance, and general maintenance on the property, a lot of times the owners may not specify what the yearly increases of that are to be. Now, the reasons why I think you should make sure that those are specified is for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason is because, at least in Kentucky, and I know in other states around the country, it's probably similar, when center owners or commercial property owners sell their property, it creates a taxable event, and ultimately, sometimes, at least in Kentucky, it does. The next year, the assessed value of that property is going to rise significantly. So let's say that the property owner has owned their property for 20 plus years, and all of a sudden they sell their property for 3 times what they bought it for. Most likely, what's happened is their assessed value has remained relatively low, and when that event occurs where they sell their property, now the assessed value recalculates, and now it's much higher. What does that mean? Well, the tenants are going to be incurring that tax bill, and the pro rata share that they're responsible for is going to remain the same, but the tax bill is going to increase. So I've heard horror stories of business owners that are paying, like, it's an example, just a quick example, $3 a square foot or $4 a square foot as far as their triple net expenses are concerned. And then a sale of a property occurs, and then the next year they end up paying double or maybe even more than that because the tax bill's increased. Obviously, insurance can increase as well, as many people are in different states. I know in Kentucky, the premiums have increased. In Florida, you hear a lot of insurance companies have pulled out as a result of a lot of the hurricanes and other natural disasters that have occurred. So premiums in Florida have increased significantly as well. So if you did not have an expense stop, is what it's called, in a lease agreement, as a tenant, you may be incurring additional expenses that you weren't expecting. So number one, when you're looking at these expenses in your lease agreement, in particular your operating expenses, make sure that you specify what a reasonable increase is reasonable year over year, because it will mitigate your downside risk of a significant taxable event occurring or insurance premiums increasing, and thus you having to pay a lot more than what you bargained for. So that's number one, is looking at the operating expense increases. Number two is the sublease provision. Now, why this is so important is because oftentimes, especially when you're dealing, when you're a new business owner, you have this aspiration where you're really excited about starting your business, and you think that nothing bad could potentially happen, but a lot of businesses fail. So you have to be able to mitigate the downside risk of something like that happening. So a sublease provision allows you to be able to sublet or release the property to a third party, and you still maintain your responsibility on the lease, but at least you can help mitigate some of the financial responsibility of the lease agreement, because now you would be able to sublet the property to a third party. They would pay you whatever rent you agree to take, and then from there you would remit payment to the landlord. So it does help mitigate some of that financial obligation or responsibility. So make sure that that provision is at least in your lease agreement. Along with that, I would highly encourage you guys to fight regarding the fees. because I've read several lease agreements recently with some of the larger landlords, and it's unbelievable that that one landlord in particular charges $2,500 just to review the application for a sublease tenant. So that means that, let's say that you want to sublease a part of your space or maybe your whole space because you no longer need the space, and a subtenant comes to you and is interested in leasing the space. You then have to go to the landlord, and in order for them to just even look at, the financials of the subtenant or whatever else, that doesn't mean they're going to approve it. They would require a payment of XYZ amount, $2,500. Sometimes it could be even higher. So it's unbelievable, some of the fees that I've seen with some of these larger landlords. And so I would highly encourage you guys to fight that, and particularly the first or second time around. I understand the reasoning for wanting to incorporate some fee as far as application review, because they don't want you to just bring a tenant every, provide them with a application every other week, because it's going to obviously take up their time and resources. So, but at least initially, I would highly encourage you guys to try to fight against review fees when it comes to providing proposed tenants to the landlord for review, if you in fact want to sublease your space. So number two thing to consider is you want to make sure that a sublease provision is within your lease agreement to be able to mitigate the downside risk of you no longer needing the space, and then at least alleviating some of the financial burden that you may incur because of that. And number two, additionally, on top of that, you really want to make sure that you fight against any review fees when it comes to proposing these subtenants to the landlord. So those are just two of the things you should consider. And then finally, number three is to consider how amortization is going to work when it comes to some of these tenant improvement allowances that you're requesting. So what often happens is when you're looking to incorporate or get into a space, a commercial space, sometimes the landlord is willing to offer you tenant improvement allowance. That means that they'll reimburse you build out dollars. So if it's going to cost you $100,000 to build out the space, and let's say it's a 5,000 square foot space, and the landlord is willing to give you $10 a square foot in tenant approval allowance on that 5,000 square foot space, that means they will reimburse you $50,000. So 5,000 for the square foot of space times the total tenant improvement dollars gives you the total amount that they will reimburse you at the end of the build out, or whatever the agreed terms are for the build out. And that obviously is to the benefit of the tenant, because it makes sure that there's less out of pocket when it comes to the build out that you're incurring. Now, oftentimes what happens is the landlord will request that some of those, expenses be amortized over the course of a lease term. So if they gave you, $50,000 in tenant improvement dollars, some landlords will say, okay, I want to recoup that amount over the term of the lease. So that may mean that now you're paying an additional $2 a square foot or $3 a square foot on top of your existing lease rate to account for the fact that they did give you this amount as far as tenant improvement dollars are concerned. And so that's not an uncommon thing, and not necessarily a bad thing. It just is part of the process. Now, what is something that you need to make sure that landlords don't push for is that, yes, you may amortize the cost of some of that over the initial lease term, but you got to make sure that they're not just going to maintain that elevated lease rate on renewals. So if your lease rate is, let's say, $30 a square foot, and you've agreed to amortize the cost of some of the build out over the initial term of your lease, and it's a 5-year lease, well, maybe the additional amount is $4 a square foot. So now you'll be paying $34 a square foot in triple net rate. Well, that's going to be over the first 5 years of the lease. But what happens is you got to make sure that come year 6, let's say you want to renew, that lease rate drops by $4 a square foot, because you should no longer be obligated to pay an amortized cost that's already been amortized. You've already paid off whatever that initial amount was that they gave you at the beginning of your lease term. So that new lease rate should be whatever the scheduled lease rate was to be minus, or whatever the scheduled lease rate was to be in the original lease agreement. So just make sure as you're reviewing the rent increase tables that you in fact are reducing the payable rate once you renew your lease after the amortized period has already expired. So hopefully you gain some value from this video. These are just some of the more common things that I see that people miss when they're reviewing these types of lease agreements. I talk about a lot of these different concepts in one of my latest books, Before You Sign That Lease, The Small Business Owner's Guide to Leasing Commercial Space. It is a comprehensive guide for individuals and business owners and investors as well. If you're interested in learning how the leasing process works, this is a comprehensive guide to learn how commercial leasing works, and hopefully you do, in fact, maximize the value received from the transaction. So if you're interested, I have this book on Amazon. Feel free to go ahead and buy it. There's a lot of people who have gotten a lot of value from it. I've got a lot of very positive feedback. If you yourself are looking to lease commercial space here in the Louisville metro area, I'd be happy to represent you in finding a space that's appropriate for your use. Feel free to reach out to me. My number is 502-536-7315, or you can reach me via email at raphael@crescentygroup.com. Along with that, if you guys like this channel, please like and subscribe. It makes a huge impact in our ability to reach a broader audience, and we would greatly appreciate the support. So thanks again so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.